He was a college dropout from Brooklyn, a math teacher at a prep school with no degree. And yet somehow, Jeffrey Epstein stepped off that chalk-dusted classroom floor and into the penthouses of billionaires, the back rooms of Wall Street, and eventually, the black books of presidents and princes. Ask 10 people how he made his fortune, and you'll get 10 different answers. Some called him a financial genius. Others whispered blackmail. Epstein himself? He preferred the mystery. The less you knew, the more powerful he seemed. But when you dig past the rumors, past the smokescreen, past the myth he built around himself, the truth isn't brilliance. It's a trail of enablers, banks, billionaires, and doors that kept opening, for a man who never seemed qualified to walk through them. How does a teacher with no degree become a Wall Street rainmaker? How does he end up with one of the largest private homes in Manhattan, a private island in the Caribbean? Private jets filled with the rich and the powerful? The money doesn't just tell a story, it hides one. This is where the mystery begins. To understand Jeffrey Epstein's crimes, you have to first understand his money. Because behind every secret he kept, there was someone willing to look the other way. Welcome to Inquisitive. This is the first chapter in our multi-part deep dive into Jeffrey Epstein. Not just the man, but the machine that made him possible. Over the next installments, we'll unravel his unexplained fortune, Ghislaine Maxwell's role as recruiter and gatekeeper, the survivors who fought to be heard, Prince Andrew's royal scandal, and the suspicious circumstances of Epstein's death. Each episode will stand on its own, but together they reveal a bigger story. A story of money, power, and secrecy at the highest levels. So hit subscribe and ring the bell, because this rabbit hole goes far deeper than anyone wants to admit. Jeffrey Epstein's story doesn't start on Wall Street. It starts in Brooklyn, 1953. He came from a working-class family, nothing flashy, no silver spoon. Jeffrey Epstein's academic path was, well, scattered. He attended Cooper Union, then transferred to NYU's Courant Institute, where he studied mathematical physiology, a weird niche field, but never graduated. Which begs the question, for someone who later told people he was a financier, how much of his early story was about prestige, and how much about hiding the gaps? He never finishes a degree at either school. It's like he wanted a foothold in elite institutions without ever staying long enough to really belong. Already there's a pattern forming. He doesn't play by the normal rules. A piece of paper will not define him, but somehow he still manages to get through the doors most people can't even knock on. At just 21, Epstein somehow lands a job teaching math at the Dalton School, one of Manhattan's most elite prep schools. This is a place where the kids' last names show up on buildings. It's not just a job, it's a networking lottery ticket. Somehow he got a job teaching math at this elite school, without a completed degree. Former students later described him as flashy for a teacher. The kind of guy who liked attention and gave a bit too much of it back, especially around the girls. A few recalled boundary-pushing moments. Flirty comments showing up at a student party. Nothing was officially documented in public records, but it was memorable enough that people talked about it years later. Inside the building, it didn't play well. The vibe was that he didn't fit the culture and crossed lines socially. Officially, the school would cite poor performance when he was let go in 1976. Unofficially, the takeaway from people who were there was simple. He didn't belong, and everyone could feel it. In the end, this turned out to be less of a setback and more of an opportunity. One of the parents introduced Epstein to Alan Ace Greenberg, the legendary chairman of Bear Stearns. And just like that, Epstein trades in chalk dust for the chaos of Wall Street. At Bear, Epstein rockets up the ladder. Options trading, arbitrage, high-risk, high-reward stuff. Within a few years, he's made limited partner. Think about that. This guy goes from being a college dropout to teaching prep school kids, to a partner at one of the most powerful and prestigious firms in the country. He's finally made the scene, and people start whispering, "Who is this guy?" But then, the first big mystery. In 1981, Epstein is suddenly out. The official story depends on who you ask. Some say he quit, others say he was pushed out. Epstein himself claimed it was over a technical violation. What's clear is that he left in a cloud of unanswered questions. And that cloud, it never really went away. So here's the real question. How does a math teacher with no degree become a Wall Street rainmaker? And why does he leave just when the money's getting good? This is where the Epstein myth really starts to take shape. Ambition, connections, and just enough mystery to keep people guessing. If Bear Stearns gave Epstein credibility, Leslie Wexner gave him power. Wexner, the billionaire founder of L Brands, the man behind household names like Victoria's Secret and The Limited, would become Epstein's most important client. But he was more than that. He became Epstein's golden ticket. In the early 1990s, Wexner handed Epstein something extraordinary: power of attorney. That meant Epstein could sign checks, buy and sell property, and even borrow money, all in Wexner's name. Think about that for a moment. A college dropout with no formal credentials, suddenly given control over a billionaire's fortune. It's the kind of authority you'd normally reserve for a spouse or a trusted family member, an actual personal attorney even. And yet Wexner trusted Epstein completely. And from that moment on, the lines between Wexner's wealth and Epstein's wealth began to blur. One of the clearest examples? The New York townhouse at 9 East 71st Street. It was once the crown jewel of Wexner's property portfolio. A massive fortress-like mansion just off Fifth Avenue. But by the mid-1990s, Epstein was living there. The ownership trail is murky. A Wexner-controlled trust transferred it to an Epstein-linked trust, and it became the nerve center of Epstein's New York life. Years later, Wexner would accuse Epstein of misappropriating what he called vast sums of money. He would say he had been deceived. And yet, for nearly 2 decades, Epstein moved in Wexner's world with complete authority, controlling assets and gaining credibility he could never have manufactured on his own. This is where Epstein's money mystery finally starts to make sense. Here, it stops looking like market genius, because it wasn't. It wasn't brilliance on Wall Street that set him up. It was proximity to a single billionaire patron with legal authority most people couldn't dream of, and assets flowing into his orbit under the cover of trust and secrecy. Up until now, Epstein's wealth seemed like a riddle wrapped in an enigma. 9 East 71st gave a clue, Wexner gave power. But the real question is, who kept bankrolling him when the world was starting to whisper rumours? Who kept funding the myth when the risk could no longer be ignored? By the mid-2000s, that once unbreakable trust starts to fray. Wexner quietly distances himself, strips back Epstein's authority. The townhouse that symbolised their bond becomes a legal riddle of trusts and transfers. The message, even if never shouted, is clear. Whatever Epstein was to Wexner, that era is ending. At the same time, in Palm Beach, the facade begins to collapse. In 2005, a concerned parent goes to the police. Detectives open a case and find a pattern. House staff, call logs, notebooks, a stream of girls, many underage, being ushered into Epstein's mansion for massages. The investigation widens. Search warrants follow. By 2006, local police recommend multiple felony charges. What happens next becomes its own scandal. The local state attorney balks, and the case gets punted to the feds. Behind closed doors, Epstein's legal team negotiates a secret non-prosecution agreement, one that shields potential co-conspirators and keeps victims in the dark. In 2008, Epstein pleaded guilty to state charges of soliciting prostitution and procuring a minor. He serves 13 months in county jail, allowed out on work release for up to 12 hours a day, 6 days a week. The significance of this is lost in many of the story bylines. Epstein, for his 13-month sentence, only had to spend 1 day a week in jail. The rest of the time he was allowed out, free to do whatever it is he did for work during the day, returning only to sleep at night. This was barely a slap on the wrist with a feather. He was, however, required to register as a sex offender at least. And yet, he keeps the trappings of wealth, the planes, the properties, the access. So, by the time that 2008 conviction lands, the picture is already complicated. Wexner is gone, the public record is damning, and the risk is no longer hypothetical. That's the moment most banks would cut ties, freeze accounts, and walk away. Most, but not all. JP Morgan, for example, continued to handle Epstein's accounts. Internal compliance units flagged large cash withdrawals, unusual flows, and suspicious wire transfers. But leadership overruled those warnings. According to reporting, JP Morgan processed hundreds of millions of dollars in funds tied to Epstein for years after his conviction. Deutsche Bank, too, later paid hundreds of millions in penalties for failures in their anti-money laundering programs, for ignoring red flags when processing Epstein-adjacent accounts. Yet throughout it all, the relationship continued. Access to Epstein brought fees, prestige, and power. Removing him meant potential loss. Victims' lawsuits would later cite these banks as part of the enabling infrastructure. JP Morgan agreed to a $290 million settlement. The US Virgin Islands got $75 million related to tax incentive abuse and bank facilitation, and Deutsche Bank paid penalties in their own settlements. Yet, each time the banks didn't just endure, they carried on doing business with people who whispered and leaked and sued. So why? Why did so many top financial institutions keep him around? Because Epstein's money came with something they valued deeply: access. Access to elite clients. Access to the kind of social circles that could open business. Access that looked like prestige. And fee revenue. The silent motivator behind risks supposedly too great for morality. These institutions normalized someone who should have been unbankable. They saw his past convictions not as red lights but as wrinkles. They saw discomfort but not liability. They saw scandal, but not scandal enough to lose profit. At scale, money not only buys silence, it buys complicity. It creates structures where laws exist, warnings exist, and yet life goes on. Because when risk is profitable, it becomes a commodity that can be tolerated. Somewhere between tax law and secrecy, there's a place where billionaires hide their money. Jurisdictions turn a blind eye and wealth becomes untouchable. For Jeffrey Epstein, that place was the US Virgin Islands. According to recent JP Morgan filings, Epstein's companies, among them Southern Trust Company, received more than $300 million in tax incentives from the Virgin Islands government between 1999 and 2018. Incentives that lowered his tax burden, waived monitoring rules for sex offenders, and treated him as a bona fide resident even while he served time after his 2008 plea. Southern Trust claimed it was doing business, but in many public documents, its work seems more paper than activity. For example, the company reportedly misrepresented its operations to qualify for tax benefits and benefited from policies that regulators later said were too lax. One striking detail: the waiver of sex offender monitoring under local law. Even after Epstein's conviction, the territory allegedly failed to enforce key legal restrictions, letting him keep access to travel, property, and business operations that many assumed would be restricted. And part of this is jurisdictional arbitrage. Epstein's firms being domiciled in the Virgin Islands meant that he could exploit favorable tax regimes, minimal checks, and political connections. The jurisdiction's Economic Development Authority, for example, awarded rebates and incentives, even when public complaints were raised. These arrangements didn't just trim his tax bill. They netted him enormous advantages. The billionaire brand he leaned on was sustained less through profitable investing and more through tax breaks, legal loopholes, and environments that prioritized wealth over scrutiny. Then came fallout, finally. The US Virgin Islands sued his estate. In 2022, a settlement of $105 million was reached. Epstein's estate agreed to pay that, and also to return substantial tax benefits it was accused of fraudulently obtaining. This is part of what the territory now calls holding him accountable, at least in part, despite the fact that it came after his demise. The Virginia Islands lawsuit calls out Southern Trust specifically for misrepresentations to qualify for economic development incentives. The trust's paperwork shows one thing on paper: employee counts, supposed operations, and reality often looked very different. Dollar signs stayed, but activity sometimes did not. This is another pillar of Epstein's empire. Not just who he knew, or how he lived, but where his companies chose to live, which laws they bent, and which governments looked the other way. If Epstein's relationship with Leslie Wexner gave him credibility, his relationship with Leon Black gave him something even stranger: legitimacy in the world of high finance long after he should have been radioactive. Leon Black was the billionaire co-founder of Apollo Global Management, one of the most powerful private equity firms on the planet. Between 2012 and 2017, Black paid Epstein roughly $158 million for what was described as tax and estate planning advice. That's not a typo, $158 million. An independent review by the law firm Desher later concluded that Black's payments were legitimate consulting fees, tied to strategies that may have saved him up to $2 billion. Black himself denied wrongdoing, insisting that Epstein simply had unique skills in tax structuring and estate planning. But the numbers alone raise eyebrows. Why would one of the savviest financiers in the world, with access to every blue-chip advisor on Wall Street, pay a convicted sex offender 9 figures for financial advice? The fallout came in 2021, when news of the payments became public. Black stepped down as CEO of Apollo after pressure from investors, though he maintained he had done nothing improper. Even so, the stain of Epstein was too much for the firm to bear. And this leads us back to the bigger question. Was Epstein really some rare tax savant, worth more than $30 million a year in consulting fees? Or was the value he offered something less tangible? Access, secrecy, leverage, or worse? The kind of things that don't show up in financial statements, but that people will pay almost anything to keep out of public view. Before we go any further, let's draw a hard line between what we know and what we don't. Here's what we can show, with public records and credible reporting. Epstein's extraordinary authority over Leslie Wexner's affairs, including power of attorney, and the transfer trail around 9 East 71st Street, the Manhattan mansion Epstein occupied. A U.S. Virgin Islands structure that conferred massive tax incentives through companies like Southern Trust, benefits worth hundreds of millions over time. Major banks that flagged unusual activity, yet continued to do business with him even after his 2008 conviction, followed years later by large settlements and penalties. And finally, the 9-figure consulting fees, about $158 million, that Leon Black paid Epstein between 2012 and 2017 for tax and estate advice. Those are facts we can stand on. Now here's what we can't prove. That Epstein ran some master blackmail for capital scheme as his core business. That intelligence services secretly bankrolled him. Or that there exists a single, definitive client list explaining his fortune. These are theories, some intriguing, many unverified, and often repeated without documentation. And that's the trap of the Epstein story. The public keeps asking for a simple origin tale, a 10x stock pick, a shadow hedge fund, a smoking gun list that explains everything. But when you strip away the myth-making, what you find isn't one secret. It's a pattern. Proximity to power, permissive banks, tax havens, fees that don't make sense. Not a genius investor with supernatural returns. An operator whose wealth was validated by the people and institutions around him, long after the red flags were impossible to miss. In other words, the money didn't just tell a story. It built a system, and that system kept him rich. But maybe that is what makes the mystery all the more fascinating. By now, one thing should be clear. Jeffrey Epstein's fortune wasn't the product of genius. It was the product of a supply chain of enablers. Billionaires who handed him access, banks that ignored their own red flags, jurisdictions that bent the rules, and associates who validated him with money, property, and trust. Each piece on its own might look like a quirk. Together they form a system. A system that didn't just make him rich, it kept him rich. Not because he was brilliant, but because he was useful. Useful to people who had something to gain and everything to lose if they pulled away. And this raises the deeper question. While the world kept asking how Epstein got his money, maybe the better question is why so many helped him stay that way. In the next episode of our series, we'll turn to Ghislaine Maxwell. Socialite, fixer, and recruiter. The daughter of a media tycoon who became Epstein's partner in more ways than one, and whose role blurred the line between high society and high crime. And then we'll hear about the victims. The young women whose lives were shattered, hidden behind balance sheets and court documents. The real cost of a machine that ran on power, silence, and complicity. This is only the beginning of our deep dive into Jeffrey Epstein. Not just the man, but the machine that made him possible. So if you want to follow the trail, make sure you're subscribed to Info Inquisitive, ring the bell, and hit like if you want more investigations like this one. Every click helps us keep digging into the stories that others would rather keep buried.